The road to the harbour curved slowly along a low ridge above the coast. Late afternoon light rested across the water. The sea was calm. Small fishing boats moved gently in the tide below. Brenna Stonehand walked at the front of the path. Her pace was steady and unhurried. The worn leather straps of her pack shifted softly against her shoulders as she moved. Behind her walked Edrin Vale. The healer carried a smaller satchel filled with herbs and bandages. He watched the shoreline as they descended the final stretch of road. "The tide's moving out," he said quietly. Brenna glanced toward the harbour. "Good sailing water," she replied. A short distance behind them, Kayla Thorne stepped along the path with quiet precision. Her eyes moved across the harbour as if measuring every mast and dock line in the distance. Ships rested across the water like dark silhouettes against the fading sky. Farther back on the path, Thomas Greywick walked with slow curiosity. One hand rested on the top of his staff. His gaze moved from the ocean to the distant lighthouse lights that dotted the coast. "The wind is steady tonight," Thomas said after a moment. "That usually means the sea will stay calm." No one hurried. The path soon widened and descended into the harbour town. Wooden buildings lined the edge of the docks. Salt air drifted slowly through the streets. Lanterns had begun to glow beneath roof eaves and beside warehouse doors. The harbour was not busy, though several merchants still moved between crates stacked along the dock. A pair of sailors rolled a barrel toward a storage shed while speaking in low voices. The sound of wood creaking against rope drifted across the water. Brenna paused near the bottom of the hill and rested her hands on her belt. "This place hasn't changed much," she said. Edrin followed her gaze. A long wooden pier extended into the harbour, where several fishing vessels rocked gently against their moorings. "Quiet town," he said. Kayla stopped beside them. She studied the harbour slowly. "Guild office," she said after a moment, nodding toward a modest stone building near the waterline. The structure sat slightly apart from the warehouses. A single lantern burned above the door. The warm light reflected softly across the damp wood of the dock. Thomas looked toward the building. "That should be the place," he said. The group continued toward the water. The sound of boots on wooden boards echoed softly as they stepped onto the dock. A fisherman lifted a crate of nets nearby and nodded as they passed. No one spoke loudly in the harbour. Most voices carried a quiet rhythm that matched the gentle movement of the sea. Lanterns hung from iron hooks along the dock posts. Their light stretched in thin lines across the water. Small waves tapped slowly against the wood beneath their feet. Kayla paused briefly near the edge of the dock and glanced toward the horizon. "Lighthouse lights," she said. Far out along the coast, a distant lantern burned from a stone tower rising above a rocky island. Thomas followed her gaze. "Yes," he said, "that island has guided ships for generations." They reached the stone building near the end of the dock. The Harbour Guild maintained a small office there where merchants recorded shipments and trade routes. A wooden sign hung beside the door, bearing the simple crest of the guild. Brenna pushed the door open. Inside, the room was warm and quiet. Shelves lined the walls, filled with rolled charts and bound ledgers. A large wooden desk stood near the centre of the room, where a merchant carefully wrote by lanternlight. The scratching of his pen paused as the door closed behind the travellers. He looked up slowly. The merchant was an older man with careful eyes and silver hair pulled behind his neck. He studied the group for a moment before setting his pen aside. "You must be the adventurers from the road," he said. Brenna stepped forward. "That's us," she replied. The merchant nodded once. "I was told you might arrive before nightfall." Edrin moved closer to the desk while glancing at the stacks of ledgers nearby. "You seem busy," he said. The merchant rested both hands on the desk. "The harbour is quieter this time of year," he said. "That leaves time to correct old records." Thomas stepped nearer to one of the shelves and examined a faded map pinned to the wall. Thin trade routes stretched across the coastal waters in careful ink lines. "Merchant work rarely ends," he said. The man smiled faintly. "That is very true." Kayla remained near the doorway. Her eyes moved across the harbour, visible through the open window. Ships rocked slowly beneath the lantern glow. The merchant followed her gaze. "The harbour rests well tonight," he said. Brenna leaned lightly against the edge of the desk. "You asked for help," she said. The merchant nodded again. "Yes, a small matter, though an important one." He turned and lifted a worn leather ledger from a nearby shelf. He opened it carefully before sliding it across the desk. Several pages contained rows of trade notes and shipping marks. One of our smaller merchant vessels sailed to the lighthouse island 2 days ago, he explained. Thomas looked up from the wall map. "The island with the tower." "Yes," the merchant said. The crew intended to retrieve an older cargo ledger stored there. Edrin tilted his head slightly. Stored on the island? The merchant nodded. Years ago, the guild used the lighthouse caves to keep records safe during storms. He turned another page in the ledger. Most of those records were later returned to the harbour. A few remained behind. Brenna folded her arms. And the ship hasn't returned. That is correct, the merchant said calmly. Kayla stepped closer to the desk. No sign of trouble in the harbour, she said. None, the merchant replied. The sea has been calm all week. Thomas rested his chin lightly against his hand as he studied the map again. It may simply be a delay, he said. That is possible, the merchant agreed. Still, the ledger they were retrieving contained several current trade agreements. He closed the book gently. The guild would prefer to recover it soon. Brenna nodded once. How far to the island? The merchant pointed toward the window, where the distant lighthouse light glowed faintly across the water. Only a short voyage from the harbour. Less than an hour by boat. Edrin looked toward the docks outside. That should be simple enough. The merchant reached beneath the desk and removed a small brass key attached to a ring. We keep a guild skiff tied along the north pier, he said. He placed the key on the desk. You are welcome to use it. Brenna picked up the key and examined it briefly. Sturdy boat? She asked. Very, the merchant replied. Thomas stepped closer to the window again. The sky outside had shifted toward early evening blue. The lighthouse lantern flickered softly across the water. The tide should remain steady tonight, he said. Kayla nodded. Good visibility, she added. Edrin rested a hand lightly on the ledger. We'll retrieve it, he said. The merchant inclined his head in quiet thanks. I suspected you might. Brenna slipped the key into a small pouch on her belt. We'll head out after we look over the boat. The merchant returned to his chair. There is no urgency, he said gently. The sea will wait. Outside, the harbour lanterns glowed brighter as the last light of day faded from the sky. Ships creaked softly against their ropes. And somewhere beyond the quiet harbour, the lighthouse lantern continued to shine across the calm evening sea. The lantern inside the guild office burned with a steady glow. Outside the window, the harbour moved slowly beneath the evening sky. The tide shifted against the docks with a soft, repeating rhythm. The merchant rested his hands on the open ledger. This harbour once kept many records on the lighthouse island, he said. Thomas stepped closer to the desk and glanced down at the faded ink marks. Stored in the caves beneath the tower, he asked. Yes, the merchant replied. The caves stay cool and dry most of the year. Long ago, the guild used them during heavy storms. Edrin folded his hands behind his back and studied the pages. Why leave the records there? The merchant turned one of the pages carefully. Some of the older ledgers were never brought back. Most were not needed again. He tapped one of the columns of numbers with a finger. But the ledger from this entry still matters. Brenna watched quietly from the edge of the desk. What makes it important? She asked. The merchant closed the book halfway. It contains shipping agreements between several coastal towns, routes, cargo schedules, and warehouse records. Kayla shifted slightly near the window. Trade paths, she said. The merchant nodded once. Exactly. He turned the ledger around so the group could see the page clearly. Thin lines marked the routes between ports along the coast. Small symbols marked warehouses, fishing harbours, and supply stops. Many merchants still follow these routes, the man explained. Thomas leaned closer to study the markings. Old agreements tend to linger, he said. That they do, the merchant replied. The room remained quiet for a moment, while the lantern flame moved gently behind its glass. Outside, a ship mast creaked softly in the harbour wind. Edrin finally spoke. You said a ship already went to retrieve the ledger. Yes, the merchant said. A small cargo boat left 2 mornings ago. Crew? Brenna asked. 2 sailors, the merchant replied. Both familiar with the island. Kayla looked toward the lighthouse light far beyond the harbour. No sign of them returning, she said. None, the merchant answered calmly. He did not seem alarmed. His voice remained steady. The sea has been peaceful all week. That is why the delay feels unusual. Thomas rested a hand lightly on the edge of the desk. They may have decided to stay overnight. That is possible, the merchant agreed. He reopened the ledger and turned several pages slowly. Still, the guild would prefer confirmation that the ledger is safe. Brenner nodded once. Fair enough. The merchant reached beneath the desk again and pulled out a rolled parchment map. He spread it across the desk beside the ledger. The map showed the harbour and the nearby coastline. A small island sat several miles from shore, where the lighthouse tower stood. Thomas studied the drawing with quiet interest. The caves would be here, he said, tracing the edge of the island. The merchant nodded. Yes, beneath the western side of the tower. Kayla leaned slightly closer to the map. Doc, she asked. There is a narrow landing along the south side, the merchant said. Old stone steps lead up to the lighthouse. Edrin looked at the water markings drawn around the island. The tide looks important there. Very, the merchant replied. The caves remain safe during low tide. When the water rises, some tunnels fill slowly. Thomas gave a small, thoughtful nod. That explains the storage method. Exactly, the merchant said. Brenner studied the map for another moment. So we sail out, check the lighthouse, find the ledger, and return. That is the task, the merchant confirmed. He rolled the map slowly and tied the cord around it again. Nothing about the island is dangerous. It has simply been empty for many years. Kayla stepped back toward the doorway. The sea is calm tonight, she said. Edrin glanced toward the window again. The lighthouse lantern glowed faintly across the water. That should make the trip easy. The merchant leaned back slightly in his chair. The guild skiff is prepared for short voyages like this, he said. Brenner gave a small, approving nod. Good. Thomas moved toward the shelves along the wall and examined a faded maritime chart. Lighthouse islands tend to gather old stories, he said mildly. The merchant smiled faintly. This one mostly gathered old paperwork. Edrin chuckled softly at that. Outside the harbour, the sky deepened into evening blue. Lanterns reflected across the water between the docked ships. Kayla watched the harbour for another quiet moment before speaking. We should leave soon, she said. Brenner agreed. The tide will be right for a return before midnight. Thomas turned away from the chart and joined the others near the door. The sea looks peaceful, he said. The merchant lifted the lantern from his desk and carried it towards the window. Soft light filled the room. "Yes," he said quietly. "It usually is." Brenna opened the guild office door. Cool harbour air drifted into the room, along with the distant sound of water moving beneath the docks. The group stepped back outside onto the wooden pier. Behind them, the merchant returned to his desk and carefully closed the ledger. Inside the quiet guild office, the lantern continued to burn with a steady glow. Out on the harbour, the tide moved slowly beneath the evening sky. The harbour had grown quieter by the time the party reached the North Pier. Evening had settled across the town. Lanterns now burned along the docks, their warm light stretching across the dark water in slow reflections. Ships rocked gently against their ropes. The tide moved with a steady rhythm beneath the wooden planks. Brenna walked at the front of the pier, the small brass key from the merchant resting in her hand. "This should be it," she said. A modest skiff waited beside the pier. The boat was wider than most fishing craft, built with thick planks and sturdy iron fittings. A small lantern hung from the mast hook. Kayla stepped closer to the edge of the dock and studied the boat carefully. "Guild markings," she said. A small carved crest was visible along the stern. The wood showed signs of long use, but it had been well cared for. Edrin crouched near the mooring rope and examined the knots. "Secure work," he said. Brenna stepped down onto the boat first. The hull shifted slightly under her weight before settling again with the gentle movement of the water. "Solid enough," she said. Thomas followed a moment later, using his staff to steady himself as he stepped aboard. The boat rocked once and then rested again. He looked around the deck slowly. "A practical design," he said. Kayla remained on the dock for a moment longer, scanning the harbour. A few sailors still moved between warehouses farther down the pier. Their voices carried softly across the evening air. Nothing seemed hurried. Nothing seemed troubled. Finally, she stepped aboard as well. The boat settled comfortably in the tide. Edrin untied the mooring rope and coiled it neatly near the bow. "Lanterns first," Brenna said. She moved to the small storage chest near the mast and lifted the lid. Inside were several oil lanterns, wrapped carefully in cloth. She removed one and examined the glass. "Clean," she said. Thomas leaned slightly over the chest and inspected the oil container beside the lanterns. "Full enough for a short voyage," he said. Kayla walked toward the rear of the skiff, where a small crate of navigation tools rested beneath a folded cloth. She lifted the cloth and removed a simple harbor chart. The parchment crackled softly in the evening air. "The island sits here," she said. She placed the chart flat on the deck so the others could see. A small circle marked the lighthouse island just beyond the harbor mouth. Thomas knelt beside the chart. "The currents run slowly along this coast," he said, "but the tide around the island can shift quickly." Edrin rested one hand on the edge of the boat while looking toward the harbor entrance. "The water seems calm enough tonight." Out beyond the docks, the sea stretched wide and quiet beneath the fading sky. A faint breeze moved across the harbor, carrying the scent of salt and wood. Brenna secured the lantern near the front of the mast and tested the small metal latch that held it in place. "That should hold," she said. She turned and looked across the boat. Rope and sail. Edrin checked the coiled lines near the mast base. "All intact," he replied. Kayla studied the sky briefly before folding the chart again. "Clear horizon," she said. Thomas leaned back slightly and looked toward the distant lighthouse light. Even from the harbor, the faint glow could be seen rising above the water. "The tower lantern has already been lit," he said quietly. Brenna followed his gaze. "Easy mark to sail toward," she said. A moment passed while the four of them listened to the harbor around them. Water tapped gently against the sides of the skiff. Wood creaked softly from the larger ships, tied farther along the pier. Lanternlight shimmered across the slow-moving tide. Edrin placed the chart safely back inside the crate. "That merchant seemed confident," he said. Brenna shrugged slightly. "Ledger work rarely causes trouble." Thomas smiled faintly. "That may be the calmest task we have been offered in some time." Kayla rested one hand lightly on the stern rail while watching the open water beyond the harbor. "The island looks quiet," she said. Out beyond the docks, the coastline faded slowly into dusk. Only the lighthouse lantern marked the island clearly. Thomas adjusted the small sail rope where it wrapped around the mast cleat. "We should reach it well before full dark," he said. Edrin stepped toward the oars resting along the inside of the hull. "Rowing first?" Brenna nodded. "Until we clear the harbour." She moved to the rear of the skiff and tested the rudder handle. The wood turned smoothly. "Well balanced," she said. Kayla untied the final rope, securing the skiff to the pier. The boat drifted gently a few inches away from the dock. For a moment, it rested there in the quiet harbour water. Then Edrin pushed lightly against the pier with the oar. The skiff glided slowly forward. Lantern reflections stretched and shifted across the water as the boat moved. Behind them, the harbour docks grew quieter. Thomas raised the small lantern flame slightly to give them clearer light along the deck. "Not too bright," he said. "Just enough." Brenna guided the rudder with calm movements. The skiff drifted steadily toward the open harbour. Kayla sat near the front of the boat, her eyes resting on the darkening horizon. The lighthouse light flickered faintly across the water ahead. "Course is clear," she said. Edrin rowed slowly and evenly, the oars dipping into the harbour water with soft, steady strokes. The boat moved smoothly between the anchored ships. No one spoke for a while. The harbour behind them glowed with warm lantern light. Ahead, the open sea waited beneath the quiet evening sky. After several more strokes, the skiff reached the harbour mouth. Brenna adjusted the rudder slightly. "That should do," she said. Thomas untied the sail rope and allowed the small canvas to open gently to the wind. The sail caught the breeze without strain. The skiff moved forward more easily now. Edrin rested the oars along the side of the boat. The quiet sound of water against the hull replaced the rhythm of rowing. Kayla continued watching the horizon. "The island will be visible soon," she said. Thomas leaned back and listened to the wind moving softly through the sail. "The sea is calm tonight," he said. Brenna nodded once as she held the rudder steady. "Good sailing water." Behind them, the lanterns of the harbour town slowly faded into the distance. Ahead of them, the lighthouse lantern continued to glow across the quiet evening sea. The skiff passed beyond the harbour mouth and into open water. Behind them, the lanterns of the harbour town glowed softly along the shoreline. Their reflections stretched across the calm water before slowly fading into the darkening sea. Ahead, the coastline curved gently toward the distant lighthouse island. The evening sky deepened into shades of blue and violet. A few early stars began to appear above the quiet horizon. Brenna held the rudder with steady hands as the skiff moved forward beneath the small sail. The breeze was light but consistent. "That wind should hold," she said. Thomas looked up towards the sail as it moved softly against the mast. "It's a patient wind," he replied. Edrin sat along the side of the skiff, with his hands resting loosely on the edge of the hull. The water moved quietly past the boat, leaving only a faint trail behind them. "The sea feels calm tonight," he said. Kayla sat near the bow, her gaze resting on the dark line of the horizon. "Clear water," she said. The skiff continued forward at an easy pace. Gentle waves lifted the boat and lowered it again in slow, predictable motion. Lantern light from the mast cast a warm glow across the wooden boards of the deck. For a while, no one spoke. The steady movement of the sea filled the quiet space between them. Behind the boat, the harbour town grew smaller with each passing minute. The sounds of docks and sailors had faded completely. Now only the open sea surrounded them. Thomas rested his staff across his knees and looked out across the water. "Coastal sailing has its own rhythm," he said after a moment. Brenna nodded slightly. "Easy to follow once you know it." The sail shifted gently as the breeze adjusted. Brenna made a small correction to the rudder. The skiff responded smoothly. Edrin leaned back slightly and watched the movement of the waves. "They rise slowly tonight," he observed. Thomas followed the pattern of the water for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That usually means the deeper currents are calm." Kayla remained still at the front of the boat. Her attention stayed on the horizon, where the faint glow of the lighthouse lantern could now be seen more clearly. "Light ahead," she said quietly. The others followed her gaze. Far out across the water, the lighthouse lantern shone like a steady star above the dark shape of the island. Brenna studied the distant glow. "That will guide us in." The skiff continued its slow journey across the open sea. Above them, the sky continued to darken. More stars appeared as the last traces of daylight slipped beneath the horizon. The lantern aboard the skiff remained low and warm. It illuminated the sail ropes and wooden mast with soft light. Edrin dipped one hand briefly into the passing water. The sea felt cool and steady. "No strong currents," he said. Thomas listened to the sound of water moving along the hull. That should make the return just as easy. The lighthouse lantern grew brighter as the skiff moved closer. The outline of the island slowly emerged from the darkness. Rocky cliffs rose above the waterline, their shapes softened by distance and evening shadow. At the highest point stood the lighthouse tower. Its lantern burned with steady patience. Kayla adjusted her position slightly. "Island ahead," she said. Brenna nodded. "I see it." The sail caught another gentle breeze and carried the skiff a little faster across the water. The waves remained calm. Nothing disturbed the quiet sea. For several minutes, the party simply watched the island grow closer. The tower lantern reflected across the water in a thin golden path. Thomas studied the shoreline carefully. "There should be a small landing along the southern side," he said. Kayla pointed slightly toward the left of the tower. "There," she said. A faint line of stone steps could be seen near the water's edge. Brenna adjusted the rudder again to guide the skiff toward the narrow dock. "Good eyes," she said. Idrin lifted the mooring rope and prepared it loosely in his hands. The boat slowed slightly as Brenna eased the sail rope. The canvas relaxed and fluttered softly before settling again. The skiff glided the final stretch toward the island. Water tapped gently against the rocks beneath the lighthouse cliffs. The air carried the quiet scent of sea salt and damp stone. Thomas looked up toward the tall tower above them. "Merchant towers rarely change," he said. "Stone keeps its memory." Kayla watched the dock carefully as it approached. "Clear landing," she said. Brenna guided the skiff beside the worn stone edge of the dock. Edrin stepped forward and secured the rope around one of the iron rings set into the stone. The boat settled quietly against the dock. For a moment, the four travelers remained still. above them, the lighthouse lantern continued to burn steadily across the calm night sea. The skiff rested quietly against the stone landing. Above the narrow dock, the lighthouse tower hung arose from the rocky island. Its lantern shone with a steady glow that stretched across the calm sea. For a moment, the four travelers remained still inside the boat. The water moved gently against the stone edge of the dock. Each small wave tapped softly against the hull before drifting back into the open sea. Brenna was the first to move. She stepped onto the stone landing and tested the ground with her boot. The old stones were worn smooth by years of tide and weather, but they held firm beneath her weight. "Solid enough," she said. Edrin followed her onto the dock and secured the rope more tightly around the iron ring set into the stone. The skiff settled into place beside the landing. Behind them, the quiet sea stretched back toward the harbour. The lanterns of the town were now distant and faint along the shoreline. Thomas stepped onto the dock next. He paused for a moment and looked up toward the lighthouse tower. The stone structure rose several stories above the island cliffs. "The tower has stood here a long time," he said quietly. Kayla climbed from the skiff last and turned to examine the small dock. The landing was narrow but sturdy. Moss grew between the stones, where the tide sometimes reached during high water. "Few visitors," she said. Brenna glanced toward the path leading up from the dock. Stone steps climbed slowly toward the lighthouse entrance above the cliffs. "They likely kept traffic light," she said. Edrin looked around the shoreline. Broken pieces of old crates rested near the edge of the landing. Time and salt had softened the wood into pale fragments. "Merchant supplies, once," he said. Thomas stepped closer to one of the crate remains and examined the faded markings. The symbol of the Merchant Guild could still be seen beneath layers of weathered paint. "Yes," he said. "This island must have stored many things over the years." The wind moved quietly along the rocks, carrying the scent of sea salt and damp stone. Above them, the lighthouse lantern continued its patient glow. Kayla looked toward the waterline beneath the cliffs. The tide moved slowly against the rocks. "Water still low," she said. Thomas nodded. "That will give us time to explore the caves." Brenna adjusted the strap of her pack and started up the stone steps. The others followed at an easy pace. Each step had been carved long ago, worn smooth by years of boots and ocean wind. Small patches of moss clung to the edges of the stones. Halfway up the path, the view across the sea widened. The open water stretched in every direction, calm beneath the growing night sky. Edrin paused briefly and looked back toward the skiff below. "It should remain safe here," he said. Brenna nodded. "The tide won't reach the landing until much later." Kayla continued scanning the island as they climbed. The ground above the dock was quiet and empty. No lights burned anywhere except the lantern in the lighthouse tower. "No movement," she said. Thomas rested one hand lightly against the outer wall of the tower as they reached the top of the steps. The stone felt cool and steady beneath his fingers. "Good masonry," he said. The entrance to the lighthouse stood open. A heavy wooden door hung beside the doorway, its iron hinges weathered but still strong. Inside, a circular stone chamber waited beneath the tall tower. Brenna stepped through the entrance first. The sound of their boots echoed softly against the stone walls. Old shelves lined the inside of the chamber. Some still held rolled charts and faded pieces of parchment. Edrin lifted one of the old maps carefully. The ink had faded, but the outlines of coastal trade routes were still visible. "Older charts," he said. Thomas studied the curved stone walls. "Merchant towers often doubled as record houses," he said. Kayla walked slowly along the edge of the chamber. A narrow spiral staircase rose upward toward the lantern room. Another stairway descended into shadow below the tower floor. "Two paths," she said. Brenna looked toward the lower stair. "The caves will be beneath us." Edrin placed the old chart back onto the shelf. That would match the merchant's story. The lantern light from the tower above filtered softly down the staircase. The stone steps below were dim but visible. Thomas gave a small, thoughtful nod. "The ledger will likely be stored somewhere down there." Kayla glanced once more around the quiet chamber. Dust rested undisturbed along the stone floor. "No recent tracks," she said. Brenna rested a hand against the wall near the stairwell. "Then we'll take our time." Outside, the sea continued its slow rhythm against the island rocks. Inside the lighthouse tower, the quiet exploration of the old merchant records was about to begin. The interior of the lighthouse was cool and quiet. Soft lantern light filtered down from the tower above. The glow moved gently across the curved stone walls of the chamber. For a moment, the party stood still and listened. The ocean could be heard faintly outside. Waves moved slowly against the rocks below the tower. Brenna stepped toward the center of the room and looked up the spiral staircase. The stairs circled the inside wall of the lighthouse, rising toward the lantern room far above. "Well built," she said. Thomas walked slowly around the outer wall of the chamber. His fingers brushed lightly across the stone as he studied the old construction. "These towers were meant to last," he said. Edrin examined one of the wooden shelves along the wall. Several rolled maps rested there beneath a thin layer of dust. The parchment had curled with age, but remained mostly intact. He carefully unrolled one of the charts. Faded ink lines showed the coastline surrounding the harbour and several nearby islands. "Old navigation charts," he said quietly. Kayla moved toward the base of the descending staircase. The lower steps disappeared into a dim corridor beneath the lighthouse floor. "Caves below," she said. Brenna nodded once. That would be where the guild stored their records. Thomas joined her at the stairwell and looked down the narrow passage. The air drifting upward felt cooler there. It carried the faint scent of damp stone and seawater. The tide must reach those tunnels eventually, he said. Edrin rolled the chart carefully and returned it to the shelf. "Then we should not linger too long below." Kayla stepped down onto the first of the stone steps. Her boots made a soft sound against the worn surface. The staircase curved slowly beneath the lighthouse foundation. Brenna followed just behind her, while Thomas and Edrin came after them at an easy pace. Their lantern light stretched along the stone walls as they descended. The sounds of the sea grew slightly louder. Not crashing waves, only the slow, steady motion of water moving through rock. The staircase ended in a low corridor carved into the stone foundation of the island. The passage walls were rougher here than the tower above. Long ago, the stone had been shaped by both tools and water. Kayla paused and examined the ground. Faint wooden planks formed a narrow walkway through the corridor. "Old merchant path," she said. Thomas looked along the ceiling, where iron brackets still held rusted lantern hooks. They once lit this passage for workers, he said. Brenna stepped carefully onto the wooden walkway. The boards creaked softly, but remained strong. Still usable, she said. Edrin looked down the corridor ahead. The passage curved gently deeper into the rock. A faint echo of moving water drifted through the darkness ahead. Caves should open further in, he said. They moved forward slowly. The lantern light revealed the worn marks of crates that had once been carried through the tunnel. Faded guild symbols were carved into sections of the wall. Kayla touched one of the carvings briefly. Storage markings, she said. Thomas nodded. Merchants like order. The corridor widened gradually as they walked. Soon the stone passage opened into a larger cavern beneath the island. The ceiling rose several feet above their heads. Water moved quietly along one side of the cavern, where a natural channel allowed the tide to flow in and out. The wooden walkway continued along the dry edge of the cave. Brenna paused and listened. The cavern remained calm and still. No trouble here, she said. Edrin looked across the dark water channel. The tide had only begun to move inward. We still have time, he said. Thomas lifted the lantern slightly higher and examined the far wall of the cavern. Another tunnel opening could be seen there. That passage likely leads deeper, he said. Kayla stepped toward the opening and studied the ground nearby. More crate markings could be seen carved into the rock. Ledger storage deeper in, she said. Brenna gave a small nod. Then we continue. They followed the walkway along the edge of the cavern. The sound of water moved quietly beside them as the tide slowly drifted through the cave channel. Above them, the island remained silent beneath the lighthouse tower. Far overhead, the lantern continued to shine across the calm sea. Deep below the tower, the party moved steadily through the old merchant caves in search of the missing ledger. The cavern remained quiet as the party continued along the wooden walkway. Lanternlight moved slowly across the stone walls, while the tide slipped gently through the narrow water channel beside them. The air in the cave felt cool and steady. Brenna walked at the front of the group. Her steps were careful but unhurried as the wooden boards creaked softly beneath her boots. Behind her, Kayla studied the cave walls with patient attention. She paused near a section of stone where the rock looked slightly different from the rest of the cavern. "Here," she said quietly. Brenna stopped and turned. The stone wall beside the walkway appeared smooth at first glance, but faint seams could be seen between the rocks. Thomas stepped closer and lifted the lantern. The light revealed the outline of a narrow stone door set into the wall. "Well hidden," he said. Edrin examined the edges of the stone carefully. The hinges had been carved into the rock itself long ago. "Merchant craftsmanship," he said. Kayla brushed away a thin layer of dust along the seam. The stone door shifted slightly. "Still moves," she said. Brenna placed both hands against the edge of the concealed door and pushed gently. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the stone slab slid slowly inward with a low grinding sound. Beyond the doorway, a narrow passage opened deeper into the island rock. Cool air drifted outward from the hidden corridor. Thomas raised the lantern a little higher and looked inside. "This must have been a secondary storage tunnel," he said. Edrin glanced toward the rising tide channel behind them. The merchants likely kept their most valuable records further inside. Kayla stepped into the hidden passage first. The stone floor was smoother here than in the main cavern. Carved grooves along the ground suggested that crates had once been moved through this tunnel many times. "Frequent use," she said. Brenna followed her into the corridor. The tunnel curved gently downward. Their lantern light stretched ahead across the narrow stone walls. The sound of the tide grew quieter as they moved farther away from the main cavern. Thomas studied the ceiling, where old iron hooks still hung from the rock. They once placed lanterns all along this passage, he said. Edrin ran his fingers lightly across one of the carved wall markings. Faded guild symbols could still be seen there. "Record storage markings," he said. The corridor widened slowly after several steps. Soon it opened into another chamber, hidden deeper within the island. This cavern was smaller than the first, but far more orderly. Stone shelves had been carved directly into the walls. Several empty crate frames rested neatly against the floor. Kayla moved carefully along the chamber wall. Her eyes followed the rows of storage markings carved into the stone. "Ledger chamber nearby," she said. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. These rooms were built to keep documents dry, even during high tide. Brenner examined the floor of the chamber. The stone here had been worn smooth by many years of careful use. Merchants trusted this place, she said. Edrin listened quietly. The sound of water from the outer cavern was now distant. Only a faint echo remained. "That is likely why they hid the entrance," he said. Kayla stopped beside a heavy iron gate set into the far side of the chamber. The metal bars were old, but still intact. Behind them sat a small stone storage room. Within the room rested a single wooden chest. The chest had been sealed with thick iron bands and a simple lock. Kayla pointed toward it. "There," she said. Brenner stepped forward and examined the gate. The metal latch had rusted slightly, but still held firm. Thomas leaned closer and lifted the lantern. The light revealed the faint stamp of the Merchant Guild on the lid of the chest. "That should be the ledger," he said. Edrin smiled faintly. It seems the guild chose its hiding place well. For a moment, the four travelers simply stood in the quiet chamber. Above them, the lighthouse lantern continued its slow watch across the sea. Deep beneath the island, the lost merchant records waited quietly behind the iron gate. The quiet chamber remained still for several moments as the party looked toward the iron gate. Lanternlight moved gently across the stone walls. The air beneath the island felt cool and calm. Beyond the chamber, faint water sounds echoed from the larger cavern behind them. The tide had begun its slow return through the sea tunnels. Brenner stepped closer to the iron gate. The metal bars were thick and old, but still strong. Rust had gathered around the hinge points, though the latch itself remained mostly intact. "Still holds," she said. Kayla studied the lock carefully. "It hasn't been opened recently." Thomas lifted the lantern slightly, so its light reached the gate. The glow revealed the merchant crest stamped into the metal latch. "Guild storage," he said. Edrin stepped beside Brenner and examined the mechanism. It should open without much trouble. Brenner wrapped her hand around the latch and tested it. The metal resisted for a moment, before shifting with a dull scrape. The gate slowly swung open. Its hinges groaned softly before settling against the stone wall. Inside the small chamber, the wooden chest rested on a raised stone platform. The platform had been built several inches above the cave floor to keep stored goods dry when the tide rose. Practical work, Thomas said quietly. Brenna stepped through the gate and approached the chest. The wood had darkened with age, but remained solid beneath the iron bands. She knelt slightly and tested the lid. The lock had already rusted open long ago. The lid lifted with a slow creak. Inside the chest rested several wrapped bundles of parchment. Edrin stepped closer. "Records," he said. Thomas leaned over the chest and carefully lifted the top bundle. A thick leather ledger rested within the wrapping cloth. He brushed a thin layer of dust from the cover. The Merchant Guild seal was pressed into the leather binding. "That should be the one," he said. Kayla nodded once. "Ledger found." Thomas opened the book carefully. Pages filled with trade routes, port markings, and cargo records stretched across the parchment sheets. Even in the dim lantern light, the ink remained clear. "The records are still in good condition," he said. Edrin looked toward the outer cavern. The sound of moving water had grown slightly louder. "The tide is rising," he said calmly. Brenna closed the chest lid and stepped back through the gate. Thomas wrapped the ledger in cloth again and carried it carefully under one arm. Kayla looked toward the tunnel leading back to the larger cavern. "Time to leave." Brenna nodded. "No reason to stay." They moved out of the chamber and back into the hidden corridor. Lantern light stretched along the narrow stone passage as they walked. The carved grooves along the floor guided them back toward the main cavern. Soon the sound of water returned more clearly. The tide had moved farther into the channel beside the wooden walkway. Small ripples now reached the edge of the boards. Edrin watched the water quietly. "It rises slowly," he said. Thomas adjusted his grip on the wrapped ledger. "That gives us time." Brenna stepped onto the wooden walkway leading through the cavern. The boards creaked softly beneath her boots. Kayla walked just behind her, keeping an eye on the shifting water line. The lantern light reflected across the surface of the cave channel. Slow waves moved through the cavern as the sea continued its patient return beneath the island. Above them, the lighthouse tower stood silent, far above the stone ceiling. Its lantern continued to shine across the calm night sea. Deep within the flooded caverns, the party began their steady return toward the surface. The party moved steadily along the wooden walkway as the tide continued to rise in the cavern behind them. Lantern light stretched across the damp stone walls, while the slow rhythm of the sea echoed through the tunnels. Brenna led the way back through the passage toward the stair beneath the lighthouse. The wooden boards creaked softly beneath her boots, though the walkway remained strong. Behind her, Kayla walked with calm attention, occasionally glancing toward the water channel beside the path. "The tide is climbing," she said quietly. Edrin looked toward the narrow flow of water beside them. Small waves now brushed the lower edge of the boards. "It is still slow," he said. Thomas carried the wrapped ledger carefully beneath his arm. "The merchants built these passages with patience," he said. "They understood the sea." The tunnel curved gently, and soon the narrow stone staircase beneath the lighthouse came into view. Lantern light spilled up the steps toward the tower above. Brenna reached the stairs first and began climbing. The others followed at an easy pace. The sound of the sea faded gradually as they moved upward through the tower foundation. Soon they reached the circular chamber inside the lighthouse once more. The room felt calm and still. Dust remained undisturbed across the stone floor. Edrin paused briefly beside the old map shelves. "Everything appears unchanged," he said. Kayla glanced towards the tower entrance, where the open doorway revealed the quiet night outside. "Dock is clear," she said. Brenna stepped through the doorway first and returned to the stone steps leading down to the landing. Cool night air drifted across the island cliffs. Above them, the lighthouse lantern continued its steady glow. Far below, the skiff remained tied safely beside the dock. The sea moved quietly around the rocks. "Boat is still where we left it," Brenna said. They descended the steps slowly toward the waterline. The stone landing looked much the same as before. though the tide had risen slightly against the rocks. Edrin untied the rope and steadied the skiff as Brenna stepped aboard. The boat rocked gently beneath her weight before settling again. "Still solid," she said. Kayla stepped onto the bow and scanned the dark horizon. The sea stretched wide beneath the moonlit sky. "Clear water," she said. Thomas climbed aboard next and carefully placed the wrapped ledger inside the small storage chest near the mast. "That should keep it safe for the return," he said. Edrin stepped aboard last and pushed lightly away from the dock with the oar. The skiff drifted slowly from the stone landing. Brenna guided the rudder, while Thomas raised the small sail once again. The canvas caught the evening breeze. The boat turned gently toward the open water. Behind them, the lighthouse tower stood tall against the night sky. Its lantern continued to shine across the calm sea. Soon the island began to drift farther away. Kayla sat near the bow once more, watching the quiet path of moonlight stretching across the water. "The harbour will appear soon," she said. Thomas looked up at the stars, slowly brightening above the sea. "The wind is still steady," he said. Edrin rested the oars beside the hull and listened to the water moving beneath the skiff. The waves lifted the boat gently and lowered it again. "Easy sailing," he said. Brenna held the rudder loosely as the sail carried them forward. "No hurry," she said. The lighthouse lantern faded gradually behind them as the skiff moved farther into open water. Ahead, faint lights from the harbour town slowly began to glow along the distant shoreline. Lanterns from dock posts and ship masts shimmered across the water like scattered stars. The journey home had begun. The sea remained calm beneath the quiet night sky. The skiff moved steadily across the quiet sea as the harbour lights slowly grew brighter ahead. Moonlight rested across the water in a long silver path. Gentle waves lifted the small boat and lowered it again with patient rhythm. Brenna held the rudder loosely while the sail carried them toward shore. Behind them, the lighthouse lantern had faded into the distance. The island was now only a dark shape against the horizon. Ahead, the harbour town waited in quiet evening light. Lanterns hung from the docks and the masts of anchored ships, their warm glow reflected across the slow-moving water. Kayla watched the shoreline as it slowly approached. "Harbor ahead," she said. Thomas looked toward the lanterns along the pier. "The tide carried us well," he replied. Edrin rested one hand along the side of the skiff and listened to the gentle movement of the water. "An easy return," he said. The skiff glided closer to the harbour entrance. Wooden piers stretched into the water like quiet arms reaching out from the town. Several ships rested there for the night, their sails tied and their decks still. The sounds of the sea softened as the boat moved between the docked vessels. Lanternlight shimmered along the wooden posts of the harbour. Brenna adjusted the rudder slightly. "That pier should do," she said. The skiff turned gently toward the north dock, where they had left earlier that evening. Edrin lifted the mooring rope and prepared it loosely in his hands. The boat slowed as the sail relaxed. Soon the skiff drifted beside the wooden pier. Edrin stepped onto the dock and secured the rope around the post. The boat settled quietly against the wood. For a moment, the 4 travellers remained still. The harbour was peaceful. Water tapped softly against the hull, while distant rigging creaked gently in the night breeze. Brenna stepped onto the dock first. "Good trip," she said. Thomas carefully lifted the wrapped ledger from the storage chest and followed her onto the pier. The leather binding remained safe within the cloth. Edrin climbed up next and glanced across the quiet harbour. Most of the town had settled for the night. Only a few lanterns remained lit along the streets near the docks. Kayla stepped onto the pier last and looked once more across the calm water. "Sea stayed kind," she said. Brenna nodded. "Usually does." They walked slowly along the pier toward the stone guild office. The lantern above its doorway still burned with a steady glow. Inside, the merchant sat at the same wooden desk where they had left him earlier. He looked up as the door opened. "You returned sooner than I expected," he said. Thomas placed the wrapped ledger gently on the desk. "The records were safe," he replied. The merchant carefully unwrapped the cloth. His eyes softened slightly as he saw the familiar leather cover. "Excellent," he said quietly. He turned a few pages and nodded in satisfaction. These will be useful for many years yet. Edrin leaned lightly against the wall while the merchant examined the pages. The island was quiet, he said. The merchant closed the ledger and rested his hands upon it. It often is. Brenner gave a small nod. Your records are safe. The merchant smiled faintly. You have the guild's thanks. Outside the window, the harbour water moved slowly beneath the lantern light. Ships rested quietly beside the docks. The long journey across the evening sea had come to a calm and gentle end.